just the talk of somebody. It's while it blossoms again. Every night I do walk in the there, looking down on my birthing my chin. This is how just the talk of somebody. It's while it blossoms again. Swollen eyes for days.
All right, hello everybody and welcome to the Everson Object Study. I am Garth Johnson, the Paul Phillips and Sharon Sullivan Curator of Ceramics here at the Everson. And I am so excited to be able to welcome interdisciplinary artist Sheila Pepe here today. And I'm going to introduce her just in a moment, but I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. As I said last week, I am so excited to be able to announce that the Everson is going to be opening to the public on August 2nd. And if you're an Everson member, and you should be an Everson member, you can join us on August 1st for a special member preview. We are scouring the place. We are figuring out a safe way for everybody to be able to come visit. So come visit with confidence. If you are immunocompromised in some way, we are going to have special hours and special provisions for you. So members, August 1st. And if you're a non-member, come visit us on August 2nd and beyond. We will be making admission free for the foreseeable future. So there should be no impediments to having you come and actually get to experience some art, because there are some exhibitions at the Everson that need to be seen more than they have been because they've been ignored over the last few months. All right, so a few housekeeping things. If you are not a frequent visitor, I want to remind everybody to make sure that your audio is on mute, but share your video with us. We'd love to see your sweet face. And you can ask questions, particularly via the chat feature. So I will be monitoring the chat feature as we go along. If you have questions for me, questions for Sheila, ask them and I will relay them. I would also encourage you to go to the upper right-hand corner of your screen and to go to presenter view rather than the gallery view. And that's going to let you see Sheila and myself. And I'm going to be sharing images and we're going to be playing show and tell. So you want to be able to see those images in all of their great big full bandwidth glory. So go full screen and go presenter view. I am going to introduce our guests right now. I think that would be best course of action. So Sheila, welcome back to the Everson.
Hi, it's nice to be back virtually. The connection is good, and you know, we do what we can.
So the Everson was lucky enough to be one of the institutions that helped tour and put together the Hot Mess Formalism exhibition. And that debuted in 2017, I believe, at the Phoenix Art Museum. And it was actually a time period that I was living in Phoenix. So I get to spend a lot of time with it in Phoenix. And then it moved to the Everson in 2018. It's been to the De Cordova. What are the other locations? Because the Bemis, right?
Bemis, right. And Nebraska. Yes. Love that place. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm a Nebraskan, and so you have hit many places that are very.
I'm stalking you.
It's a good thing to have your exhibition following me.
Well, they're all wonderful places, and they all meet a very specific community need. And this is my favorite kind of museum.
And you currently have an underseen exhibition. Would you care to talk about it? And
Sure.
Are you able to reveal future plans about that exhibition?
Yes. My wife, partner, and sometimes collaborator, Carrie Moyer, and I have a show that opened about a week and a half before the Corona closing hit. And it's called Sheila Pepe, Carrie Moyer, or Carrie Moyer, Sheila Pepe, Tabernacles for Trying Times. So it's now reopened to the public. It's at the Portland Museum of Art in Maine. and they have a kind of time-ticketed means of having just the right number of people in the museum. And I hopefully, fingers crossed, will be able to go back and help with the deinstall, because we're packing it for a portion of it to come in January, I believe, of 2021 to the Museum of Arts and Design in New York City. So we're very excited about that. Interestingly, it's kind of being reimagined in some ways for the new coronavirus display mandates, but none the same. We're really happy and excited and hoping for no new curves.
Me too. And in a general sense, we talked a little bit before we went live about how the sort of lockdown and quarantine has been for you in the studio. Can you talk about that a little bit from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. Well, what's interesting is I came back from the install in Portland really exhausted because there were multiple works that went up, and took a little break. And then that little break turned right into the lockdown. And so I have been out of the studio for a long time. And to be honest, I got the virus, and that took a good month out of my waking life. And post-COVID, I'm pretty sleepy. It's interesting. I have I don't know what it is, kind of narcolepsy that comes with after the effect. But I've not been making a lot of work. I've been trying to connect with people online, trying to be part of learning channels like this one. I'm involved in a great kind of, it's really international white women's group. We're trying to teach ourselves how to be anti-white supremacists and good educators, and really trying to take on the moment in a meaningful way. And that's all feeding me and feeding the next iterations and productive time in the studio.
So I'm excited to see what those next steps are. And when I was putting together a social media post about today's conversation, I tend to be a little bit flip sometimes on social media. And I love to think about ideas of craft being rebellious or thoughtful, or a way to push back against sort of dominant modes sometimes in the art world.
I love you.
I started to type, join me for a conversation with Sheila Pepe about her studio skullduggery. And I don't know why that word popped into my head. And
I'll keep it.
I second thought it a little bit, because skullduggery has dishonest or negative connotations. But I would say, in thinking about what I know about your studio practice, I think you're constantly engaged in a process of creation, deconstruction, undermining. Can you talk perhaps about skullduggery in the studio?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes from just growing up from a position of feeling like I would not be included in this thing, and then finding gradually a seat at the table and realizing that the things that made it really living for me were not necessarily the seat at the table, but once you have a seat at the table, the ability to speak plainly about why this thing you were about to become a part of seemed so, in some ways, adversarial or non-inclusive or problematic, and also just to keep things alive. I mean, my immediate family, I mean, I think a lot of people know I was raised in a Catholic Italian American family, so I'm second generation. My immediate family was very focused on assimilation, so we did not have crazy screaming fights. We had a few, but it wasn't like, I love you, not like my uncles would say at the top of their lung, Sheila, get me a beer in the Frigidaire. So it wasn't that emotional. But we have a kind of understanding that things can be dialectical, to get a little bit philosophical about it, and emotional. and that this is a really creative place and an exciting place, and it's just good juju for the studio. I don't know, to borrow somebody else's kind of religious language. And
So we're going to get,
it just seems creative. I don't know. Tell me. Yeah.
so we're going to get back there. And for those of you
Yeah.
who are joining for this conversation with Sheila, this is the way that the conversation will be going, which is kind of the magic formula that I've hit upon lately for these conversations. We are going to bring up about 5 artists from the Everson's collection and talk about their work and use that as an introduction and a lens to talk about Sheila's work. And we'll be constantly sort of reiterating the theme that Sheila suggested, which I'm really excited about, and we will get to in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so and I want to remind everybody to go to the Everson website, www.everson.org, and you can bring yourself up to date with things that we're doing. You can find out about the virtual programming that we're doing and about some of the exhibitions that we are planning for the fall and beyond. And don't forget that you can visit the Everson Ceramic Database, where you can find information on the ceramic nationals. You can find images of pieces in our collection and ephemera and research materials about the pieces in those materials. And we are hard at work expanding those to the Everson's video collection and other facets of the Everson. So welcome, Sheila, and I pulled this photo out as one that I was really excited to show everybody. It is in the sculpture court of the Everson. So you can see our I Am Pei design sculpture court, you can see the coffered ceilings, and you can see just a little bit of the spiral staircase, but the space is dominated by this freeform installation of yours, Sheila. So the theme that you had worked out, which I'm really intrigued to talk about, use as a way to talk about some of the artists in our collection, is the idea of not only working in series, which I think is something that most artists do to some extent, but working in an open series where there are variations within the series, and those variations sometimes can add up to a whole. I was interested in, I was going back through some of the videos from your Hot Mess Formalism installation, and in particular, it was great for me to hear you say that you liked to play studio games. So can you reflect a little bit on that theme and why it occurred to you, and the whole idea of games being an important part of your studio practice?
Well, I'll do the serious philosophical part of it first. Early on in my education, I encountered a little bit of Wittgenstein, where he talks about games as a kind of analogy for understanding language. And of course, I think art making is a language, and that is organized in a similar way. So he talks about the definitions of things being as a family resemblance or as games, meaning there's no one defining or bullet point set of a description that can define what games are, because there are some games like solitary games that are card games, ball games, then ball games that are team games and team games. And so they're a very elaborate, if we would think about it in mathematical terms, a very elaborate Venn diagram, or as people make mind maps now, there's a very elaborate set of similarities and differences. And so, and I encountered this before the computer, and so it seemed like a very, it seemed like a homecoming to me, because this is the way I've always thought, and worried that I couldn't keep kind of linear track on my thoughts and my making interests. And when I found Wittgenstein, I felt like, okay, there's an explanation of this that's larger than I am. And so it also then dovetails with, naturally dovetails with just a childhood of play that was often work, because I grew up in the deli or in the yard, where I would sort fill my pockets with stones or acorns or something that I could fill my pockets with. And then later on the back patio, organize into types and colors. And so this idea of accumulating and organizing, I'm sure it's some part of developmental arrestment that that I got stuck in, and I've just circled that for a long time. It's also allowed me to feel free. That another analogy, that it's like cooking, and it's like you're working on some different things simultaneously with different endpoints or completion points in sight. So that's how it is. It makes me feel more relaxed in the studio, and it's always can accommodate a new idea that I have that might not fit anywhere. Once that happens, it potentially starts its own category for further development or replication or accumulation. So yeah, that's how it works.
And I think that one of the things that I've noticed about your studio practice is that, many artists work in sort of a discrete series, and that series goes into an exhibition and becomes an exhibition, and the artist might move on to the next series. It's interesting that you have studio strategies, and some of the things that make these sets of things and series of things open is that they exist over a long period of time and exist and overlap with a lot of different exhibitions. Can you talk about giving yourself the permission to engage in these things without time limitations?
Well, I think part of my early seriously women-identified lesbian feminist era, we looked at a lot of ancient forms. I know we do that again now, and it's wonderful, but there were some forms that we found in you look at the archaeology of Catalhoun, when places that seem to have matriarchal cultures, and I think one of the forms we found was a spiral. And so I found this idea of the spiral to be a kind of interesting model for evolution, that it was not a straight line and it's not necessarily a circle, because that would be series Groundhog Day all the time. But a spiral seemed to work, because there are often times in my life where I felt like I've been here before. I need to learn something new to grow more, to find the next new iteration of life. And so I think it's that sense that it can kind of all come back again, that and that there's an interest in that kind of that form. But also, I was taught as a young person that your work gets really good when you're old. I wasn't taught that young people necessarily make great work. I clearly come from a different place in the world, but my education was never really involved, and I think it's probably because my education was outside of New York City, but it wasn't involved in a kind of youth culture. We had a good time, but there was a freedom to grow. There was an expectation to grow.
And I think that's one of the things that is interesting to me, being the curator at the Everson, is that there's this real conversation about generations and youth culture and not. And one of the strengths of the Everson's collection through the Ceramic National exhibitions is that we oddly have the early work of many, many artists who would go on to sort of dominate the field. But we didn't necessarily collect the mature work of those artists. And so now I find myself in a place of really reflecting on the early work versus the sort of mature work that people go after. So that's not exactly the transition that I was aiming to make, but I thought that in sort of keeping that theme alive and talking about working with series of objects, Annabeth Rosen is an artist that we talked about in depth last week when we were talking about drawing, because she's one of my absolute favorite artists when it comes to having a sort of prickly independent drawing practice that is
Yes.
what independent of what's going on with objects in the studio. And there was a thing that she said that really brought everything together, where she claims that her drawings are always 3 years ahead, or about 3 years ahead of what's going on in the studio, and that her studio and the objects eventually sort of catch up to where her drawing practice is.
That's interesting.
But I did actually bring out the piece that I only showed a picture of last week. So for those of you who are repeat viewers and here with us again, I'm going to actually pick up my camera and we can get up close and personal with
so
this
cool.
incredible assemblage. And so you can see my hand for scale. This is no sort of shrinking violet of a piece. It has all of these, sort of writhing coils of clay on the top of it. And let's see if I can actually.
It's so great. I love these things. Happily, I've seen a related work in person, so I'm just projecting all of my object lust upon it.
Well, there is a certain sort of bodily understanding of those pieces, but
yeah.
It's interesting that I think from the beginning of Annabeth's sort of mature work, she came to this strategy of creating multiples, and I think there is a strength to her in creating a piece that can then just be sort of mindlessly replicated. I say mindlessly, but it's a part of what's going on in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And then those parts become the raw material that a whole is made from.
Right.
Sometimes, and this piece dates from 1999, all
great.
of these individual pieces are sort of put together with slip and glaze and sort of glazed together into kind of a brick-like object. There was a period, and this still happens, where the pieces are lashed together with wire or zip ties or sort of other materials to make up a larger shape. But this ability to sort of give yourself permission to work in the studio and not have writer's block or creator's block in the studio, I think is kind of an effective one. And can you?
Yeah. So. Yeah, I totally. On a microcosm, I think the answer to your question about the freedom to do so is, if you're given a really long leash in terms of when you get good, there's an open-endedness about how much you can act like mindless and I say mindless because we often associate mindless with stupid, but this is without a verbal mind. This is bodies only. Bodies only need apply. And when you're really kind of closing the gap on a tactile and visual experience that is neither one dominates. The optical can't dominate because otherwise the thing is not dimensional, and the dimensional can't dominate because you would get something near perfection, most likely. So the space where you trust the gestalt of your knowledge, I think people call that intuition, and just go. It's kind of, elevated motor memory. And the eyes watching, I think, and I have a great affinity for this methodology where there's a great deal of imperfection embraced. And it just feels like, A, she's having a great time. B, she's making a total mess. And C, she could be talking in the way that she does in a very lively manner while she's doing it, or not at all, right? So it's a kind of intelligence that I think we do not understand any longer. I think that we've gotten to a place of either performance perfection or marketing or branding where those learning how to give yourself the freedom to do that is not part of the curriculum anymore. And I think it has to do with you have to produce something now instead of, well, you might have to produce something next week or in 20 years, who knows? So you could just start pitching things into that into that future.
I think many people on this call know that I started as a maker, and you know, and most curators that I know don't really come from, um, you know, master's degrees in museum studies or curatorial studies, and almost everyone that I know in the curatorial realm has at least part of a meandering path. But it's been a real learning experience to learn to listen to uh, and learn from artists and their intuition, because they're coming from a place that's radically different, thank God, from my artistic intuition. I want to actually move on to the next artist.
Sure.
I think the idea that you brought up about imperfection is one of the entry points that we can talk about with this artist, and that
Right.
is Stephanie Sahuko. And Stephanie's an artist that I've known personally for well over a decade, and I actually did some writing about her work early in my career. I'll talk about that in a moment, but let me share my screen again. And I'm going to talk about the piece very briefly that's in the Everson's collection. So this is a piece that is called Raiders, or it's from a series called
I love this.
Raiders. And Ryan Lee is Stephanie's gallerist in New York City. And this was her very first show with Ryan, and sort of her New York debut. And it's one that's near and dear to my heart for reasons that I think a lot of you can probably guess. It is ceramic adjacent and craft adjacent, which is where Stephanie, I think, finds a lot of her work. And if you can't quite see it, I think this next image shows it a little bit better. These are all cut out photographic prints that are mounted on wood. And Stephanie always operates on lots of different layers. One of the layers that she's very interested in is a level of open source technology. So finding resources that are available to anybody on the internet. And all of the images, it's my understanding, that are put together in this series actually come from the publicly available images that museums make available to the public.
Right.
So, you know, sometimes she might get them by like scraping the museum's website slightly illicitly. You'll see pixelation come up. These are not meant to be perfect facsimiles, although I will say with the Everson set, we have installed them at a way that when you walk through the entrance of an exhibition, you see them perfectly framed, and it's only in walking around the piece that you discover that they are not a really incredible collection of imperial Chinese porcelain. There's a level of, so Stephanie's family comes from the Philippines. She's Filipina, and she's obsessed with ideas about the bootleg and how bootleg economies work, which oddly dovetail sometimes with the ethics of museums. And with this particular series, she's interested in the museum being like sort of a cache of plunder that the museum has gotten through various means. I mean, collectors who have collected them illicitly and illicitly, you know, colonial practices. And China is a really interesting site of being able to sort of examine these things, which is one of the ways that this series becomes, I think, really powerful to me.
It's kind of, it's perfect timing, isn't it? I mean, this is a piece that, well, it doesn't completely predate, but it is prior to this very energized moment about talking about decolonizing museums and ideas of repatriation. And yeah, each country, I think, poses a different problem or request. You know, I'm still waiting for the so-called Elgin marbles to go back to that, back to that magnificent museum that was built just below the Acropolis. They're ready. They're perfectly ready and waiting. But so I love this piece because, as the photograph can do, it appears to be perfection. And the trickery of that is completely undermined right at the second look, which is acknowledging the dimensionality of this stuff. I think in person it'd be fun to, you know, get closer and closer and closer and realize that the highlights and shadows on stuff are maybe a little confusing, or you know, looking up at the lighting saying, is that right? And then, you know, walking around the thing, which is the very social part of sculpture. You know, as it's object making and sculpture making has always been a social event. And then seeing the, you know, it's like a movie set or something. Like it all looks great in the front, and in the back, it's just a prop.
Yeah,
love it.
Stephanie's work is very political, and you know, I think bringing up Ai Weiwei as someone who works similarly with the cultural touchstones and power of ceramics as a medium. And you know, a big part of the reason why Ai Weiwei did his piece with dropping the Tang Dynasty urn, there was a level of protesting the almost, I'm going to get in trouble here, but there's a nationalism, I think, that China uses with its cultural heritage, and it's thorny, and the relationship between this nationalism and colonialism is incredible to dig into. And Stephanie has a riot sort of digging into those layers.
And I'm sure seen very differently from people who are of various Asian heritages and not China, because it's most likely that the technology and other things are coming from a grand appropriation, right?
Absolutely.
It's coming from everywhere.
So I'm going to kick back to the beginning or earlier on in Stephanie's career. And by the way, hi to Aaron Toole, who I can see in his studio making some pots. And Aaron works daily with Stephanie and is at the University of California, Berkeley ceramics and sculpture program, where Stephanie is the new sort of Richard Shaw and Peter Volkos. And
wow.
Really
I know
to have him.
It's the mothership, or should I say the fathership, now becoming the mothership.
Yeah, the artist Nikki Lee in particular has done a really powerful series where she's has deconstructed Peter Volkos's old kiln, and has done pieces about this sort of patriarchy in these bricks. And anyone who's visited the UC Berkeley art department knows that it is a vastly different world than it was back in Volkos's heyday. But I could go on and on about that, but I want to bring up an earlier piece from Stephanie that I feel fits into the playfulness of this thing that we're talking about, and it has a link to something that is near and dear to your heart, Sheila, and that is crochet.
Yay!
I'm going to play this clip, which is actually from Stephanie's star-stealing cameo in one of the latest Art 21 episodes, where she talks about this project.
I come from a pretty traditional sculpture background in the sense that I spent 4 years in art school.
Oop. Sorry, let me pick back up again. I accidentally shifted the screen.
I come from a pretty traditional sculpture background in the sense that I spent 4 years in art school, literally just making things. You know, to hand make something means you're going to process it. Like, it comes into your head, and then it moves through your body, and then it gets pushed back out into the world. I'm interested in how objects reflect cultural moments. And I think I'm trying to figure out, you know, why we value what we value. So with the counterfeit crochet project, I invited crochet crafters from all over the world to join me in bootlegging designer handbags. The invitation was to choose a designer handbag that you would like to own but couldn't afford, download an image from it online, and then using your own crochet crafting skills, hand make it. And interestingly, it touched a nerve, and lots of people started to join up and then send me photographs of themselves with their handmade bags. It was fun and lighthearted, but invariably what would happen was, we would have these really great discussions about everything from the hierarchy of the fashion system to, global counterfeiting schemes. I think one of the reasons I got interested in this idea of like bootlegs or counterfeits is actually, it's an extension from this idea that there is an authentic. And, from a very personal standpoint, I was really curious about what it meant to be an authentic Filipino.
Okay, so it's all there. All of the roots of the things that she explores in her career are in this project. And as a quick aside, Stephanie got me into so much trouble with this project. I was writing at the time for Craft magazine, which was an outgrowth of Make magazine. And I got to do an article about this because it really was very close to my heart in the things that I was examining at the time. And Stephanie had a line of thinking and talking about this. One of the things that interested her the most about crochet with this period was giving people these sort of, and these are her words, like quote unquote clunky tools, people taking on ideas of couture using their home crochet skills. And I literally quoted her sort of word for word, but the moment that this was published, and this has been the biggest incident like this in my writing career.
I can just imagine.
Came after me.
Yeah.
And, they rightly said, crocheting is not clunky, like this is the same process as lace, which is like artisanal and fine. And
but I have to give it to you. The scale of the hook and the yarn and the quality of the yarn and the number of holes in that crochet, clunky. I mean, I picked crochet because it was, a little clunky, when I started crocheting, it was really, everybody was knitting. It was kind of the north-south divide. If you kind of look at the global south, mostly crochets, the north knits. And I actually think that some of it is about climate. I don't think you could go out on a fishing boat in a crocheted sweater. Wouldn't do the same thing. But I think it's okay. I give it to you because padding and lace making is a radically different material set and scale, size.
I was happy to engage in this conversation, but a little bit afraid as well. But ultimately, I'm happy that the crochet world can rise up as one and put a sort of privileged white male writer in their place.
Oh, that's sad. That's sad.
So, very quickly, we should keep moving along, and I'm going to actually excise a few of the artists that I was going to talk about. But I wanted to bring up Eddie Dominguez as an interesting artist. And we've been talking about artists who maintain playful strategies within their studio. And that impulse to find play within one studio doesn't come naturally to everybody. And oddly, I'm an artist who was constantly using humor and, satire in my work. But one of the reasons I think why I'm a way happier curator than I was as an artist was that I never found the right balance, I think, of play in the studio in terms of the actual creation of the objects. And Eddie is someone who I think has that, although as Eddie is getting older, I think he's probably in his mid to late 50s now. Like a lot of ceramic artists, he's encountering back issues and sort of other body issues, and he's having to adapt. But the act of throwing on the pottery wheel is, I think, central to creation for him. Also this sense of carving that relates back to his Mexican, Hispano-Catholic sort of upbringing in New Mexico. So the thing that he's most known for within the ceramics world, arguably, and in the art world, are these incredible dinner sets. So each of them is a discrete set, but what you're looking at, if you're unfamiliar with his art, each of these flat panels that is like a leaf or a cluster of foliage is a plate, and it is a functional plate that's using sort of the colors and the carving inherent in Mexican folk culture. And it has all of these stacked sets of cups that make up the flowers. So it actually becomes this joyous set that allows you to have a feast and sort of break apart, to come together with people. And then it all sort of stacks back into its set after the whole thing is,
I love it.
is over. So he is perfectly sort of threaded together. I think there are a lot of potters who doth protest too much about them being artists and always thinking of themselves as artists. And I'm not going to argue with that. And then on the other hand, there are plenty of sculptors who work in clay who doth protest a little bit too much that they are certainly not potters or sullied by the clay world. And Eddie has managed to sort of thread all of these things together really beautifully and joyously and playfully in these sets.
I think this is, you know, in seeing this work, I have a great admiration and an affinity to somebody who wants to have their cake and eat it too. This idea of both and that we would see the world as an accumulative place that maybe required some categorization for use or for play or for reflection. But this is amazing. This is like is the definition of part and parcel in my mind, that you could have all these separate parts, but would they kind of, I just see this very animated, everybody goes back together on their own accord after they leave the sink having been washed and dried. You know, they all go back into their place. And I love that idea that we always need a decoration in the house, like this full out, like, guess what? We're decoration. We're the kind of sculpture that makes life more jubilant. And then on the other hand, we work hard too. Both.
That's really beautiful.
We're both.
That's great. And this is the piece that the Everson is actually fortunate enough to have in.
Oh, this is so beautiful. I was
collection.
Looking at this before.
Yeah, and each of these pieces is, each of these shadow boxes, I guess, are about the size of a record album, about 12 inches by 12 inches. And this came from a legendary queer ceramic collector who commissioned this for his home, and he and his partner experience this daily. It's called Everything But the Kitchen Sink, and it actually lived over their kitchen sink physically.
That's so perfect.
It had this domestic space. It has all of these playful wah, wah, wah references to sort of, you know, queer culture and kitsch. Oh, and by the way, speaking of which, I'm happy to announce next week's theme, and I'm going to be joined by Ryan Wilson Kelly, the Washington state-based sculptor, and we are actually going to be talking about kitsch as sort of the foundational part of our conversation. But he's also a queer male artist who engages with history, performance, and sort of threads all of these things together.
I think that the queer thing is definitely has historically been the province of gay men. But I have to say, if you live in New Jersey and have some kind of ethnic affiliation, you've got kitsch too. You know, my aunts are all, in their prime, were queens of kitsch, and they didn't even know it. So I love this piece because it's just so jubilant and beautiful.
And I think Eddie will be an amazing eventual guest to bring back and talk about the exhibition that he did at the Everson as well. So I'm going to shift gears, and we're going to talk about two more artists very quickly, artists that Sheila and I could spend forever. But the first one is a Japanese artist who really came to prominence in the 1970s, and her work from the beginning was in conversation, in dialogue. And I would argue that within ceramics, painting, and sort of the Dwayne Hansen super object world, that Trompe l'oeil is as intelligent of a conceptual strategy as any. I think because it is high touch and high craft and quote unquote slick a lot of the time, people aren't actually able to sort of unpack the sort of incredible layers. And Takako Arakai, I think, began working, I'll show you one of her earlier pieces. So her process, I think, is inherent. And I think people who do come from a ceramics background will recognize this level of sort of pushing oneself to sort of ridiculous levels of craft that aren't necessarily seen and appreciated in the final object, but are embedded in there for the sort of sake of the maker. So each of these pieces, each of the sheets of paper in this Bible is a thin piece of porcelain that Arakai silk screened slip onto. So an actual sort of photocopied Bible page that's been made into a silk screen. She silk screens them on the individual pages. And each page in this, if I were to destroy this piece and take apart each of these layers, you would be able to see all of these hidden layers of text that exist here.
Crazy.
And she does not cut corners. But throughout her career, the pieces became more and more abstract and more subject to, I guess, the forces of nature, although she was that force of nature. And I'm going to actually show you, I'm going to unpin the sharing here, and I've got my camera. I'm going to put on my handy dandy gloves for, by the way, you know, you'll get to see me put these gloves on. We keep latex gloves mainly around the Everson instead of the white cotton gloves because they will actually promote the dropping of things. But this is the ideal thing for a ceramics curator with Butterfingers tendencies because it has all of these grippy silicone
It's
beads
great.
on it. And I get to sort of look like a soccer goalie when I'm doing it. So this is Takako Arakai's Decay Bible. And I'm just getting little chills right now because the sun has come out in Syracuse and is shining into our IMK space through a skylight. So you can see that the base of this piece is this sort of marble-like, stone-like accumulation. And she's built up layer after layer of all of these leaves, all of these pages of
So amazing.
text. Absolutely. And, you know, as I get closer, you can see all of there we go. So you can see all of the edges and all of the text. And, you know, this is one of the most confounding objects, I think, within the Everson collection. And we'll be bringing it out on display in an exhibition that is sort of provisionally titled The Floating Bridge, that examines postmodern Japanese sculpture, which is actually the strength of our Japanese sculpture collection in the Everson. But I think this kind of has it all when it comes to what you would want from a sort of Japanese ceramic sculpture. It is ethereal, there's a high sense of touch and materiality, yet there's something that's almost unknowable. It's a little bit like looking at the mukarnas up on the ceiling of an Islamic mosque.
You know, that when I teach, I really focus on the fact that it's the decisions of the artists that count. And all we've been talking about are various kinds of decision making. And so when we talk in a naturalistic way of her kind of giving way to, it's like as if a river kind of flowed through, and then you say, no, it's her. It's like, yes, this is somebody who's just gotten so deep inside her own problem that she started making radically different decisions about what it could be or what it could say. And these are so much more multivalent works than the earlier ones.
Agreed.
It's amazing.
And similar to the strategies that you use in a lot of your work in terms of open series, you know, this is a series that she created throughout her career. So,
Yeah.
you know, a 30, 40-year time span, and there was something powerful for it, for these that brought her back time and again.
Yeah. What I
Okay,
think is, keep going, and
ahead.
no, go to the next one, but I just want to say,
Okay.
as you're switching slides, that this is a different approach than mine at the moment, because this is somebody who's digging deeper into an idea, as I think the next artist is. And I think a lot of my strategies have been to keep things, to trick myself into keeping things rather fresh and unknown. And so difference plays a much bigger part in the collection of things than I do than similarity. I guess
There's the skullduggery. You're tricking yourself.
yeah, I'm trying to trick myself. Yeah.
Indeed.
Well, that is a wonderful, gnarly piece of art.
So I am so happy that, you know, this is the second time we've used the word gnarly, and to use gnarly in connection with Toshiko Takaezu, I think is, you know, an interesting word choice. And it's one that I fully endorse with this piece. And one of the things that I think I've always intuited about Toshiko Takaezu's work is that, you know, she was a lifelong potter. Using her pottery skills, began, as many potters do, as like a strictly functional potter, and then the act of closing her vessels became this sort of radical act that you know, we acknowledge as it's sort of a foundation of kind of modernism in ceramics, like in a certain way, making these into sculptures rather than sort of vessels in their own right. But I've always seen a sense of struggle rather than comfort with Toshiko Takaezu's work. And, you know, I will argue that in her lifelong practice, which centered around these closed forms, I think she was constantly pushing the envelope, but was always comfortable working within, you know, this certain idiom. And I'd like to share something, and I've teased Sheila with this, that sort of is along the lines of this thesis. And this is a video that comes from 1970. So this is fairly early in Toshiko's career. Has been creating closed forms for at least half of a decade. She's living in New Jersey at the point that this video was made. So this is part of a video called With These Hands that accompanied the Objects USA exhibition originally in 1970. And this video chronicled 8 artists connected with the crafts, including Toshiko Takaezu, J.B. Blanc, Peter Volkos, Paul Soldner, Clayton Bailey, oddly, who we spoke about several weeks ago. But I'm just going to let Toshiko's hands kind of speak for themselves and play a couple of minutes of Toshiko at the Potter's Wheel.
Amazing. Thank you.
Pardon the audio, this was transferred from a 16mm film strip. But there's something oddly appropriate as you look at this wobbling pot to hearing this stretched out 16mm stock audio.
That wobbling pot gives me hope.
Yeah. Amen. Am I right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the only thing I can do.
Look, so any of you on this call, you know, who teach throwing, there she is, like, arguably, you know, one of the heights of her career is she's getting this recognition doing the things that I do on the Potter's Wheel.
Everything falls
I'll
in
shut up.
place if this is what you really enjoy doing. With clay, you know, you are completely physically like mixing the clay and wedging the clay, and you just have this huge block of spunk on you throw right on the wheel head. If you really get involved, really evolve, and sometimes without knowing that you get involved, you can almost hear things with the clay. And you can see that peace with the clay also, because the material is alive and you just work, you know, like a dance movement. you know, a little pressure here, a little pressure, and all of a sudden you see this thing grow right in front of you. And some that's very, very beautiful. Sometimes that's enough when you have this thing just grow by itself like that. It's like magic in some ways. If I'm going to put raw clay in, I got a piece of paper, maybe paper towel, and wrap these.
Okay, so this video is so revelatory for me. I grew up in the 1990s within Sheila, as you've called it, mudhead culture.
Yeah.
Getting to see, you know, not just macho sort of male Don rights demonstrators, but, you know, really facile, you know, women. And I am almost completely the product of a female education in the studio, but 90s workshop culture of sort of stepping in and, you know, enthrallingly throwing these things, getting to see Toshiko Takezu working on this creaking treadle wheel and slowly and contemplatively building up the walls and, you know, revising the piece is really incredible to me. And this is not sort of the only mode that she worked in, but when I see a Toshiko Takezu piece, you know, this is one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about. And I love the thing that she says about the material sort of being alive, and you can see it sort of growing and living.
When I see that, I'm reminded that I've grown up in a relatively Puritan culture, trying to adapt to that Puritan culture as best I can, but still with these this feeling of there's something else, and she's showing us this something else, which is this massive ability to pay attention with your entire self. And I think that's what it's gnarly. It's not very Christian, if you know, I mean, it's something else. There's something else going on there.
So to go from that to, I was going to bring up, so I am the product of Midwest Protestant guilt, and you know, we can come together with two different types of puritanical struggle here. But I am someone generally who is not a jealous person when it comes to other collections and pieces that, you know, sort of live in other collections.
Because you're a good citizen.
Yes, exactly. But I have to say that the Racine Art Museum in Racine, Wisconsin, you know, which, to bring things back to Objects USA and S.E. Johnson Corporation, who sponsored that whole exhibition, they have a set of 6-foot-tall Toshiko closed forms that affect you so bodily. Like you have to stand among them, and they let people walk among them, and they like experiencing a Jun Kaneko piece.
Yeah,
they are hug size and immediately sort of take you over bodily. Roberta Griffith chimed in, and she put in an endorsement that Toshiko was in fact an incredible workshop giver in her own right, which I have no doubt about. And Roberta said that she, you know, I think did reku and burned newspapers and had incredible ways to, and she of course taught it. She was a product of Cranbrook and had incredible strategies as an educator as well.
Amazing, yeah, I bet.
So I just very quickly wanted to show off one of the Everson's many Toshiko pieces, and this is a later piece that I think is probably salt fired. It's either salt fired or soda fired. You can see the cobalt that's streaking through this. And this is a much more facile piece when it comes to sort of the speed and the construction and the scale versus the other piece that
Yeah.
you saw. But she makes up for it in like a real sort of engaged surface. And I think that this was a piece that Toshiko kept and then donated directly to the Everson in 2006
That's
as she
great.
was struggling with some illness. But you can see that there is a teeny tiny opening at the
Yeah.
top, but just turning it around in space, and we don't often get to see the bottom,
I love it.
you know, of
I think
a Toshiko
this-
piece.
When I was doing a lot of clay and had access, you know, when I was a student basically and had access to building my own clay bodies, I was a salt kiln gal and a low fire manipulator, and I mean all those things where this color was going to come out of some strange concoction you and then go, and then nature go. That's a beautiful thing.
Man. I was, I'm going to bring in one last
Good.
artist because I noticed that he is actually here on the call, and I don't think that I've ever met him in person, but that is Tim Rhoda. And Tim,
Oh, great.
yeah, you're welcome to unmute yourself and say hi. And I'm going to just bring out one of your pinhole cameras that are in the Everson's collection. So hi, Tim.
Hi, how you doing, everyone? Thank you.
Hi, Tim. It's great to meet you.
You too, virtually. I mean, I didn't want to Zoom bomb this. I was just here to learn and
Wait a minute. Napoli, what's that hat say?
Oh, it's a soccer team.
Okay.
Napoli, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so Tim, you can correct me if I'm talking out of school on this, but if you are not familiar with Tim's work, he is an incredible photographer, and you know has worked with photography. He's also trained as a skillful potter, and I don't think that it's not a coincidence that he created this series, but one of the reasons why I'm very proud to have this series of pieces in the Everson's collection is that it fits in with a lot of the strategies that Sheila and I have been talking about. So as a trained darkroom photographer, Tim, can you talk really briefly about the spark of inspiration that led to you to actually create your own pinhole camera and cameras out of clay?
Sure. I mean, so I'll start by just saying I'm not a trained photographer.
Okay.
I've never taken any classes before. My education is only in ceramics. And, you know, but I think just at some point, like I just couldn't say contextually, like what I wanted to say with an object. So I started working in photography. With this particular body of work, my camera broke, which I used for like years and years. It was my father's. And, you know, I mean, there's been so much in this conversation that I've enjoyed listening to, but I am classified, I guess, as a zennial. So like I've spent half of my life in the analog world and half of my life in the digital world. So I think with, you know, I can speak both languages. It would have been really easy to buy a new camera. I could have gotten my camera fixed, but I was trained in ceramics. You know, it's funny, I was like, as you were talking about some of the mud heads, you know, I was thinking like, you know, my teachers have been like Arthur Gonzalez, kind of finds his own way, like Akio, Doug Jack, Chris Staley, but then like Liz Quackenbush has probably pushed me the farthest, and like her work is so quirky. Yeah. And like, I always think about Liz saying, just do it. So I just decided, you know, I thought like I could probably build these things. And, you know, there's a lot of trial and error. Like I play in my studio. I don't know what I'm doing. I figure it out. The results start to like kind of give me more information. And, you know, I think that's kind of where these cameras came from. I'm goofy. So like, you know, this is a DC, I think 360 camera because I get tired of all like the photo text talking technology that I don't understand. So I just thought I'd make this really stupid looking thing that can take photographs from different angles.
It's great.
So
Yeah.
if you've ever made an oatmeal box pinhole camera, and this is similar, there are slots where the film can go into and the electrical tape or the actual sort of shutters for letting the light in. And the Everson, I should point out, also has the photographs that were created by the piece. So this is, and I like to talk about these in terms of sort of function as well as
Yes.
and stretching function in that way that Eddie Dominguez does in a certain sense.
It's also like, you want function? I'll give you function, just not where you want it. There's also a man who wants to have his cake and eat it too. I mean,
Thank you.
yeah, no, it's good. I mean, it's a, you know, it's not like we don't love you, ceramics. It's just that we want to keep you humble and happy.
And I will point out that Tim is very probing in his approach to different cameras, and he sort of evokes different styles and different feelings with each of the cameras, even though I'm just going to show this one. But Tim, can you plug your website where people can see more of your work?
Sure, thank you. You know, I think that, you know, I'm an avid chess player, and I think that there's, you know, there's more than one way to kind of get to the end result. So like, that's how I kind of take materials in my studio.
It's also funny because photography would be another craft that is, has some, you know, it needs some goofy steps or something. It needs a little Monty Python going on over there because it can be extremely serious and sometimes kind of dark ways, and isolates itself on occasion. So
Indeed.
I think Tinya hit a twofer there. That's a threefer. Yeah. It's great.
Okay. So sadly, we're going to have to move along, not sadly, because, you know, this is sort of the meat in the sandwich, or the, for those of you who are vegans, the seitan and the sandwich. But I want to make sure that we have a good 25 minutes to chat about Sheila's work, which we could sort of go on and on about. Tim, thank you so much for logging in. I didn't get in touch with you ahead of time, but I did tag you on Facebook. So great job of seeing that tag and being a detective and tracking us down. And
I saw the word kindred spirit, and just amongst like Annabeth Rosen and some of these other people I love, you know. So I was just like, wow, that's nice.
Okay.
Welcome to the pack. Even outside the main community, welcome.
All right, so Sheila, I
Yes.
would like to start the conversation by talking about a piece that is actually in the Everson's collection. And this is the piece, Women Are Bricks, which in the original Phoenix iteration of Hot Mess Formalism was right at the entry of the exhibition. Right. And this piece has its genesis very early in your career, right. And so it was interesting to see it presented chronologically, but I always see this as a little bit of a touchstone, I think, for the things that, you know, you would go on to
absolutely
investigate. So
and I give a lot of talks, and so this is, for many years, was at the very beginning of the talk as something, and I think when I started talking, I assume they're students, or it's literally for students, and so I always felt like from the beginning of my career. Yeah, I know that was a good slip, right? That I would show them student work. And after many years, I would look at this and think, man, this is, that's the yeast, or that's the sourdough, or that's an amazing, everything comes out. And it kind of goes to this way of working that every work creates a new bodies of work, that I'm really deep into this idea that when one works, you create your own physical library of new possibilities. And as much as we perhaps start our careers by talking to older artists or contemporary artists, we're kind of talking back and forth to make our own place in the world by altering past examples. This is part of my like original language, and it does a number of things. It was made first in, I think, 83 for my last review board at Mass Art with Jana Longacre and Ben Ryder Band, who are still there. And this was the height of my, well, it wasn't the height, it was the jumping off point, jumping out of school of my, my feminist awakening. And so all these essential forms, as I said before, the going back to prehistory, the idea of the triangle being this feminist form, an essentialist form of describing the mons or describing the uterine triangle. This was all embedded, and then that they would have these different colors and the authenticity of the clay and the fire relationship between the fire and the clay body pulling things out. But of course, and then the idea of returning home, that this was in fact a domestic revolution first, that, you know, the revolution was happening around the kitchen table of a bunch of feminist lesbians. Of course, I took it home. I think the original rug went to a friend or went into the dumpster. I don't even remember. And then the bricks and the rollers went into the backyard of our collective household in an effort to make a small patio or the beneath one. And after one winter, they were all gone. So it was like, okay, that's good. And so one thing that is not present here is this idea that for many years in my future, I would make a lot of very physical but ephemeral work. But when Gilbert and I started talking about this piece, I said, you know, I have to remake this piece because it's so much the beginning of so many different things, the small objects, the combination of materials, the interest in mixing things with fibers, the iteration of multiples, the idea of a set theory, and probably more than I can't even articulate. So that's what we did. I got some help with the Hunter studio, people at the Hunter studio. I made, you know, access, and we made some clay, we bought some clay, we mixed some clay up. I'm sure that people who were helping me there thought I was a mad person. They're like, are you really gonna mix that stuff up? And I'm like, oh yeah. Yeah, and we're looking for variety here. And I think they were a little surprised. I think it looks like a refined version of the original with a little bit more like adult hands at work. And finding that rug, which is really close to the original, was just a miracle and really made it happen. So there it is, the beginning of many things.
I had a really profound experience, actually. I have been a great admirer of artists sort of associated with the pattern and decoration movement. And
Yeah.
I was lucky enough to be in Los Angeles right before the COVID outbreak, and I got to see the With Pleasure exhibition that is up right now. But you know, you're making this thing in 1983, and you know, the pattern and decoration you know, is sort of in the air, and there is kind of a radical and feminist component associated with it.
Yeah. I don't think I was aware of P&D specifically, but what I was aware of were, I was aware of Joyce Kozloff because she was in some of these anthologies of women artists. I was aware of Eva Hesse, of course. There were a few. And I wasn't as aware, because I was still really working in a kind of undergraduate modality, of where and how my sources were coming in. What I knew, and this continues in the work to come, that I was choosing two really different places. Like it was, I knew that it was sacrilege to put the rug underneath that stuff. I already had a little hiccup by putting cement rollers underneath it. So at that time, the idea of inclusion of other materials was really you know, I had support, but I had a little pushback as well, which just kept me honest.
You know, we've brought up the idea of intuition, I think, multiple times here, and it's going to be a good transition to talk about the votive modern pieces, because there's so many associations with domestic and material culture. I think
Right.
it's obvious that rather than walling yourself off in some hermetic modernist garden, I think you've always found an attraction in objects that have their own life and symbolism.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that I probably don't give ceramics enough credit, mostly because I don't think a general audience understands the history of ceramics as a tabletop thing, and understands that this is also, you know, I talk a lot about the votives being called votives because of growing up in, you know, for the first 18 years of my life, growing up in a home where the only sculpture is the religious sculpture on your tabletop, on your nightstand, or on your dresser. And that I had encountered other small sculptures of the scale by big name artists, but it was always thought as like studio models or something. For years I would get, are these models for something? And I'm like, no, they are what they are. And a real pushback on size being a problem for being seen as serious. And of course, that is very much associated with the issues that surround what we would call the decorative arts, right? The little figurines and, you know, things that are only seen in a domestic setting and are not part of either sculpture from a plaza or an architectural site, or a 20th century idea of a Soho scaled studio, you know, a large volume studio where serious, or the landscape where serious art gets made. And I say the landscape in that, you know, a private park of abstract work that gets put into a private landscape, or a pub, or, you know, whatever. So the votives are almost a relic of a work called the Doppelganger series, which isn't shown here, which is early and still open set of works that has two parts, an object, a shadow, and a wall drawing. But there was a time when I pulled the objects out at one end and the drawings out on the other end, and went kind of literal. And the commitment that I made in about, I don't know, I mean, I've made this size work since the 80s, but as a series since maybe 94, 93 or 94, that this would be an open set that described a family resemblance, that I would chart every different kind of object that could occur at this size. And some more referential to a body, some less referential, some more having like working parts or closed forms or open forms, or, and so this is a perfect lifelong pursuit. Like the family resemblance set is like an enormous net. It's got so many holes in it. It'll take me a very long time to close those holes up and more affiliations and associations. But you can see the means of making are, you know, it's the bricoleur. It's assemblage in some cases, but some of that assemblage like this, it's completely handmade. Like the other yellow and orange, or yellow and red piece, all of the assemblage is underneath the fabric wrapping. So you're kind of left to guess what's under there, with a tiny hint at the base that there's a purchased old ceramic form underneath there that's, you can see just the foot of. And it's that kind of tiny reveal that I'm also really interested in, as you do and know, and why I love being around, you know, museum people and conservators and people with a really amazingly refined eye, is that these little reveals and little touches are really trying to say, here, look, there's information here. If you get it, great, you're in my inner circle. If you don't, and you just see this big form, well, then that's another story. But this idea of like concentric circles of valences, literally shared paired electrons going around there, valences of meaning, and different associations, different audiences that go with each of those readings.
I live with my two favorite art critics in the world, which are my two daughters, who are now 6 and 8.
They're the best.
They got to see this exhibition, and it's incredible that when the pieces were presented, there was a strategy of presenting them on sawhorses at table height, and so it was sort of undermining and underlining at the same time a domestic sense with the pieces, but there was no sort of frowning or second guessing with my daughters. They were completely engaged.
They got it, yeah.
By all of these pieces, and I think knew that in a sense that they could probably put things like these together themselves, and there was a sense of that. But all of the uses of the different materials, it was like that you had left you leave a set of breadcrumbs about the materials that allow us to sort of know the materials and their associations as well.
Funny enough, I take a minimalist approach to truth in materials or reveal in materials as a strategy, but not an aesthetic. I mean, that aesthetic crops up on occasion, like a use of the grid. But I think that showing the process is the kind of lean edge of every craft. And that high craft is all about, and I'm talking about painting to bronze casting to ceramics to every craft you could imagine, photography, that woodworking. Concealing the means of making is what I think of as high craft, where you have like 10 people or experts that can tell you how this thing got made. Ironically, I find the minimalist approach, this truth and materials approach, to be very egalitarian, and also a prod to myself and to my audience, where I always say, you can do this at home. Like a lot of my crocheting is saying, you already do this at home, and you probably do it better than I do. Like there's a just enough means, which also is inspired by like a Winnicott psychology of like the good enough mother, where you don't want to be too good or too complete in any work, because you cannot, then you are no longer leaving any room for the audience to be involved, to project themselves into or onto the object or the image. And that's a real guiding force for me, is not being too perfect or too high-minded. I can be earnest as hell, and that can include some humor. But yeah, let's keep going. What else you got in there?
So one of the reasons why I love co-hosting with you is you're really good at bringing things to a point where I can make a transition that sounds really smart or something. But
oh, you're smart anyway. You don't have to.
So we're actually not going to dig into your, I would say, signature work, which are your monumental crochet, freeform crocheted pieces. But I wanted to talk in this conversation about your drawings, which is something that when I brought students to your exhibition at the Phoenix Art Museum was sort of a source of endless conversation. And you are an incredible draftswoman when it comes to your drawing practice in the studio. There is, in my mind, a bit of a yawning chasm between your approach to craftsmanship in the with your objects and your votive series in particular, and there's a sense of obsession that goes into your drawing, and I'm imagining that there are probably different parts of your artistic personality that are being reconciled. But when you were making drawings, and particularly the series, I have 2 drawings that I've queued up here that were part of Hot Mess Formalism. they relate to cityscapes, architecture, but also abstraction. There's a very careful sense of color and mark that's being used in these pieces. I think you're using good like archival papers. Can you talk a little bit about the differences in approach to craftsmanship between different parts of your sort of studio self?
Sure. So first I want to say that all of these drawings exist in tandem with related fiber installations that took on a similar palette of color and theme. So this one I think went with it. There were two simultaneous shows, one in New York and one in Boston. One called I Love New York and the other called Bridge and Tunnel. So it was really my return to the New York, New Jersey area, to return to the 20th century romance that I left. And I was living in it and working in it. And it was just, it was like overwhelming. There are draftsmen who would consider my technique less than perfect. So on a drawing continuum, I'm somewhere in the middle, but I have to say that drawing is the thing I have done the longest. And it's the oldest thing in the patch, right? It's the thing that comes from my my liberal arts education as the core of all things. And so it really reveals my traditional Western roots as an artist. And this, for example, is me really working hard to get into the flow of mid-century modernist moves in terms of the syncopation of the line and the calligraphic marks and the kind of open grid and just the feeling like it's 1960, you're 1 year old. This is a drawing you would have had in your bedroom, you know, if your parents were high modernists instead of the Virgin Mary, you know. So there's a bit of nostalgia and a desire to teach myself what it is my own history is. And so there's a lot of mid-century means formalism that are shot through all of the work from mid-century on to the end of the 20th century. And then I think I go back in history in some way and try to bring things up forward. So yeah, there were in the show, there were many other types of drawings, some less masterful, some with a less liquid line or, you know, that kind of thing. And it's just, something like this is just the number of days I've been drawing, to be honest. You know, if I've been drawing consistently for a couple of years, things like this can happen. If I'm not, no. I mean, I haven't been drawing for a couple of years. I'm not going to make a drawing like this just because my hands aren't there. My body isn't in that space. But they'll make another kind of drawing that exists in the set, which I'll pitch over into that direction. So, yeah, this stuff is a kind of like odd American ventriloquy or something. It's me trying to be in another history almost. And it's also asserting I mean, these are relatively small drawings. This one in particular, it's kind of asserting that this is, New York modernism is in truth a local phenomena that took over the world for a variety of good and not so good reasons. And so for me, it's affirming that this is a rather small location in the global aesthetic, you know, and it's personal for that reason.
So I'm going to, speaking personal, I'm going to bring things full circle by bringing up identity again and material culture again. So we started out by talking about women are bricks. And I'm going to actually bring up this series of photographs and have you introduce this in terms of talking about.
So this was also included in the Hot Mess Formalism. It's a video from '96 when I was making a lot of analog videos. You know, I was making analog videos in school. When I left school, I was really making crazy analog videos and rented cameras, and we're still talking about tape here and messing up.
Can you say go and I'll animate it when you're ready to have me
so
do
it's called ambient painting. And then I'll leave the parenthetical part of the title out until we get to the end. How's that?
That sounds great.
For me, this is a painting, the high point, the apex of the art world, the center of the universe, large P painting.
All right, we ready?
Ready, go.
Okay.
So that's the stop animation version of the video, which I think is fun. And here it is installed in, I think, '97 in a collection of objects and installations called Hard Work at the Rose Art Museum, and I believe 1997. And so this corner of the room is just, you know, ironically, you can see the very first use of crocheting, tying one object to the other. And this is one of those big TVs that you might find at home with a big plastic back, tied and crocheted to the office chair from the studio, and some chains that I might find in my 1970s New Jersey home that would have some plants hanging on, you know. So, and this is all in a kind of Kissonier way, or another mentor and reference, Judy Pfaff kind of way. It's a drawing. So at this time, absolutely everything I was making, I was thinking as a drawing, whether it was video and painting, because it had color. This was like, oh, make me a painting. There's some use of color, not a lot, and most of the color is kind of kept to a perhaps a little happy yet dowdy 70s home decor that I picked up by living through it. Yeah, and that's my grid painting. I'm a good painter. I'm a good artist now. I made a painting.
So we're gonna end, and we're going a little bit over in fine style, but we're going to bring things back to the present and show one more piece that points at the present and the future.
Yeah, so this is the first in what I know will be a series. It's like the first and only time that I've ever had an image of something I want to make, not in full detail, but a type of thing I want to make, and a title come to me at exactly the same time. It's called American Bardo, and Bardo being the Tibetan idea of the time spent between the moment of death and the moment of reincarnation. And in that gap, overused word, but in this case, it really is a kind of gap, the great opportunity for enlightenment, for changing the course. I like to think of it in real terms on the ground, for kind of changing the course of history, or reconsidering, opening oneself up to a kind of presentness that changes everything. It doesn't look too hard at the past or too hard at the future. And I think, you know, I made this, and then COVID, and then the uprising happened. So I feel like I'm on the right track for some reason. But this is what we call a kneeler in the Catholic Church. Now, I'm incredibly Catholic culturally, but you'd probably call me a secular humanist in terms of belief systems. And I've been studying world religions along with world history for the past 5-10 years to try to broaden my sensibility. So it is both a Catholic instrument, and in my mind, very American in this kind of like DIY collaborative kind of construct that's also like block forms and really rudimentary ornamentation and upholstery that is on the top a little high modernist, on the below a little waiting room. And then if you show us the next slide or the previous slide, the front. And it's filled with all this kind of ornamentation that I have observed in places like the foyer of the Tenement Museum in New York City, where the ornamentation is made out of like cast plaster parts and things that are painted. And then the whole thing is painted over within an inch of its life, like all of those, you know, apartments, for me, apartments on the Lower East Side, where the thing is, the tenement has been painted so many times that you cannot close the cupboard doors. So that's the kind of American aesthetic and the gesture that for some people and for some white people will still seem like a very familiar, wonderful place of respite and reflection, and for other people will seem like the most other thing in the universe. And I love this cultural location as a problem, and also bringing to fore all kinds of questions, hopefully non-committal questions about what religion is and what it's for, and how the body has certain rituals in various cultures of various religions, which I think is amazing. So I like the fact that I can call it by one name, it's a kneeler, and say to myself, I will make more kneelers, and then have no expectation about what exactly they'll look like.
I can't wait to see where these go. By creating a series of kneelers, you're also sort of implying an eventual space, perhaps, for when they come together. So
Yeah.
to bring things back to our theme today, this is an object that you suddenly have sort of flashed on and made that is going to be working its way into an open series of things. And so I'm looking forward to seeing this open series resolve themselves into some larger something.
Yeah, me too. It's a wonderful permission. So yeah, that I give myself.
Sheila, I want to thank you. Your theme was too good in a way. We talked a long time about a lot of the pieces in the collection, but thank you. You are an incredible co-host to have. I look forward to rolling with you at some point in the future. And I want to tell everybody that Sheila is going to be featured in an exhibition coming up next year at the Everson called Abstranded, that is going to feature Sheila alongside artists like Sanford Biggers, who are working with ideas of fiber and abstraction and identity. And it is going to be a messy, interesting wrestling match for everyone to observe at the Everson, also perfect for our times. So thank you for joining us. And
Thanks everybody for being here.
I'm going to turn the recording off, but I would invite anyone who wants to unmute themselves. This is the after party. So if you want to say hi to Sheila or myself, it would be great to see your face, and join us next week at the same time for a conversation about kitsch with Ryan Wilson Kelly. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.
All right, so let me stop screen sharing, and I'm going to stop the recording.